Hello everyone, welcome back to Whisper Tales channel. Before we get started, comment below where you from and what time you are watching. And if you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, let's get into it. Story 1. The Wendigo of Whitefish Falls, Ontario. The winter of 1987 hit Whitefish Falls harder than anyone could remember. The small Ontario town, population barely scraping 800 souls, found itself buried under 6 feet of snow by early December. The isolation was complete. Highway 6 became impassable. Phone lines snapped under the weight of ice, and the closest help in Manitoulin Island might as well have been on the moon. Sarah Mitchell worked the night shift at the town's only gas station, a lonely outpost on the edge of civilization, where truckers occasionally stopped to fuel up before braving the long stretch north. That December night, the thermometer read -38, the kind of cold that made your lungs burn and turned exposed skin white within minutes. She first noticed something was wrong when old Tom Barefoot came stumbling through the door at 2 a.m., his eyes wide with a terror she'd never seen in the 70-year-old Ojibwe elder. Tom had lived through residential schools, fought in Korea, and buried 2 wives. Nothing rattled him. But that night, his weathered hands shook as he gripped the counter. "Lock the doors," he whispered, his breath forming clouds in the heated air. "It's walking again. After all these years, it's walking again." Sarah wanted to laugh it off, attribute it to the old man's age or maybe too much whiskey, but something in his eyes stopped her. She locked the doors. Tom collapsed into a chair by the coffee machine, muttering prayers in Ojibwe that she couldn't understand. "What's walking, Tom?" she asked, pouring him a cup of black coffee that he ignored. "My grandfather told me about the winter of 1923, Tom said, his voice barely audible. 15 people disappeared from Whitefish Falls. They found them in spring, what was left of them. Bones cracked open, marrow sucked out. Teeth marks on the bones, but not from any animal anyone could identify. The elders knew what it was. They'd seen it before." The lights flickered. Sarah felt her heart skip. Just the wind affecting the power lines, she told herself. But Tom's eyes darted to the windows, and she saw real fear there. "The Wendigo," he whispered. "It comes in the deepest cold, when hunger drives men mad. It was a man once, long ago, a trapper who got lost in a blizzard, ate his partner to survive. The curse took him, changed him, made him something else, something that can never stop hungering." Sarah was about to respond when they heard it. A sound like branches scraping against the roof, but rhythmic, deliberate, like footsteps. Something was walking on the roof of the gas station. Something heavy. The security camera monitor showed only static. Sarah grabbed the phone to call the police, but the line was dead. The scraping stopped. Then, a face appeared at the window. If you could call it a face, the thing looking in at them had once been human. That much was clear from the basic structure. But the skin was gray-black, pulled tight over a skull that seemed too large, too elongated. The eyes were sunken pits that somehow still gleamed with a terrible intelligence. Its mouth, dear God, its mouth was filled with teeth like broken glass, and its lips were torn and bloody from its own constant gnawing. Tom began praying louder, clutching a small medicine bundle he'd pulled from his coat. Sarah couldn't move. The thing at the window tilted its head, studying them like a cat watching mice. Then it smiled, and blood ran from its torn lips. The window exploded inward. The cold rushed in like a living thing, and with it came a smell like rotting meat and old copper. The Wendigo moved wrong, its limbs too long, joints bending in ways that shouldn't be possible. It was inside before Sarah could scream. Tom stood up, holding his medicine bundle high, speaking in Ojibwe with a voice that carried authority despite his fear. The thing paused, its head snapping toward him with predatory focus. For a moment they stood frozen, predator and prey, ancient evil and ancient knowledge. "Run," Tom said to Sarah without looking at her. "Run and don't look back." Sarah ran. Behind her she heard Tom's prayers turn to screams, then to something worse, a wet, tearing sound that would haunt her dreams forever. She burst out the back door into the killing cold, running toward the town center, her lungs burning with each breath of frozen air. She made it to the police station, pounding on the door until Deputy Mike Brennan let her in. Her story sounded insane. She knew it did. But Mike had grown up in Whitefish Falls. He'd heard the stories. And when they returned to the gas station at dawn with 6 armed officers, they found Tom's medicine bundle in a pool of frozen blood. Tom himself was gone, along with most of the security footage. The remaining tape showed only static and shadows. The official report listed Tom Barefoot as missing, presumed dead from exposure. But the locals knew better. They found tracks in the snow leading into the forest, tracks that started human but gradually changed into something else, something with claws. They found other things too, scratches on trees 15 feet up, bloody patches where something had fed, and always that smell of copper and decay when the wind blew from the north. 3 more people disappeared that winter. Janet Crow, a teacher walking home from the school. Brian and Patricia Ouellette, a young couple whose car was found abandoned on Highway 6. Doors open, engine still running. The RCMP brought in search teams, helicopters, tracking dogs. The dogs refused to follow the trails. They would whine and pull back, tails between their legs, when they caught certain scents. Sarah left Whitefish Falls that spring, as soon as the roads cleared. She moved to Toronto, found work in an office building where she was never alone, never in the dark. But sometimes, on the coldest winter nights, when the wind howls between the skyscrapers, she remembers that face at the window. She remembers Tom's screams, and she knows that somewhere in the endless forests of northern Ontario, something that was once a man still walks, still hungers, still waits for the deepest cold to come again. The gas station stands empty now, windows boarded up, for sale sign fading in the sun. Locals drive past without looking. And every winter, when the temperature drops below -30, when the snow piles up and cuts the town off from the world, people lock their doors a little earlier. They check their windows twice. And the elders burn sweetgrass and sage, keeping the old protections alive, because they remember what their grandparents knew. Some hungers can never be satisfied, and some curses never die. In 2019, a film crew from Toronto came to Whitefish Falls to document the Wendigo legend for a paranormal TV show. They interviewed locals, filmed the abandoned gas station, even camped in the woods where the tracks had been found. On their second night, their equipment captured audio that their sound engineer couldn't explain. A voice that wasn't quite human, speaking words in no language anyone could identify. The crew packed up and left the next morning. The show was never aired. When pressed, the producer would only say that some things are better left alone, and some stories don't need to be told. The raw footage was destroyed, but one crew member kept an audio file. Sometimes late at night, he still listens to it, and in between the static and wind, he swears he can hear something that sounds almost like laughter. Story 2. The Pit at Pickle Lake, Manitoba. Pickle Lake sits at the end of Highway 599, the last stop before the great nothing of northern Manitoba's wilderness. In 1994, the mining town's population had dwindled to just 400 people, mostly workers from the gold mine and their families. That's when they found the pit. It wasn't supposed to be there. The geological surveys from the 1970s showed solid bedrock all through that area. But when Consolidated Mining expanded their operations that September, their excavators broke through into emptiness. The hole that opened up seemed to swallow light itself. Marcus Webb was the shift supervisor who made the discovery. He'd been operating heavy machinery for 20 years, carved tunnels through mountains, but nothing had prepared him for the moment his excavator's bucket punched through what should have been solid rock and found nothing. The entire machine lurched forward, nearly toppling into the void before he managed to reverse. The pit was perfectly circular, about 30 feet in diameter. The edges were smooth, almost polished, as if something had bored through the rock with tremendous heat. But it was the depth that unsettled everyone. They lowered a weighted cable down to measure it. After 1,500 feet, the cable went slack, but not from hitting bottom. It was as if the weight had simply disappeared. Company protocol demanded they report the discovery to head office in Winnipeg, but the mine manager, Bill Harrison, saw opportunity. Unknown geological formations could mean unknown mineral deposits. He ordered the hole explored before filing any reports. They sent down cameras first. The footage showed smooth walls continuing down into darkness. At about 200 feet, the temperature readings started climbing. At 500 feet, the cameras began malfunctioning. The last clear image showed what looked like carved symbols on the walls, but the geology team insisted that was impossible. No human tools had ever been down there. That's when they decided to send a person. Jake Morrison volunteered. He was 25, needed the hazard pay for his new baby. They fitted him with climbing gear, heat-resistant suit, and a helmet camera. The plan was simple. Descend 300 feet, document what he saw, and come back up. Jake went down at 10 a.m. on September 15th. His helmet camera transmitted everything back to the surface. For the first 100 feet, his breathing was steady, his comments professional. He noted the strange smoothness of the walls, the way his lights seemed to dim despite fresh batteries. At 200 feet, things changed. The temperature gauge showed 90 degrees Fahrenheit and climbing. Jake reported a smell like sulfur and something else, something organic and wrong. His camera started picking up movement in the darkness below, shapes that didn't make sense, that seemed to shift when observed directly. "There's something down here," Jake's voice crackled through the radio at 250 feet. "The walls! Jesus Christ, the walls are wrong! They're not rock! They're moving, breathing! This whole thing is breathing!" Marcus ordered him to surface immediately, but Jake's response was confused. He said he could hear singing, beautiful singing from below, calling him deeper. His camera showed him looking down into the darkness, and for just a moment, something looked back. Eyes, dozens of them, reflecting the light like stars in a void. Jake screamed. The camera feed cut to static. On the surface, his safety line went taut, then began paying out rapidly as if Jake was descending fast, too fast, faster than gravity alone could account for. They tried to break the winch, but the line snapped. They heard one last transmission from Jake's radio. Not his voice, but something speaking through his equipment. The words were in no language anyone recognized, but everyone who heard them felt the same thing. Hunger, ancient and vast. They tried to seal the pit that afternoon, but the explosion that was supposed to collapse it only made it wider. The charges detonated wrong, sideways instead of down, killing 3 workers and injuring a dozen more. In the chaos that followed, several people swore they saw Jake climbing out of the pit, but wrong. Moving on too many limbs, his face stretched into something that wasn't quite a smile. The military arrived 2 days later. Not local forces, but special units from CFB Shiloh that no one had seen before. They evacuated the mine, declaring a geological instability that required immediate quarantine. But the workers talked. They talked about the soldiers with flamethrowers, about the screams that came from the pit at night, about the thing they glimpsed being hauled up in a containment unit that looked too much like Jake Morrison, but with skin that shifted and eyes that had multiplied. The official story was a mine collapse that killed 4 workers. Jake Morrison was listed among the dead, his body supposedly never recovered. His widow received a settlement that required signing papers she wasn't allowed to read. She moved away within a month, wouldn't say where. But Pickle Lake is a small town, and secrets don't keep. Workers from the mine reported strange dreams after the pit was found. Dreams of falling endlessly through warm darkness, of things with too many teeth singing lullabies that made your bones ache. Some woke up to find dirt under their fingernails, as if they'd been digging. Others found themselves sleepwalking toward the mine at night, drawn by something they couldn't name. Dr. Emily Roberts, a psychiatrist brought in from Winnipeg to treat the traumatized workers, kept detailed notes that were later leaked. She documented a shared delusion among the exposed workers. They all described the same entity living in the pit, something vast and old that had been sleeping until the excavation woke it. They called it the Hollow Mother, said it had been waiting in the earth since before humans walked upright, feeding on whatever fell into its domain. The mine was officially closed in October 1994. The government cited economic reasons, but the rushed nature of the closure raised questions. Equipment worth millions was left behind. The site was declared off-limits, with Canadian forces maintaining a permanent guard post that still operates today, though they won't say why. In 2003, a group of urban explorers managed to sneak past the guards and into the mine. They found the pit had been covered with a massive steel cap, welded shut and covered with warning signs in multiple languages, including some symbols that didn't match any known alphabet. Around the cap, the rock was scarred with what looked like claw marks from the inside, as if something had tried to get out. One of the explorers, David Park, took photos that he posted online before they were quickly removed. But people saved them, shared them. In one image, you can see the steel cap, and beneath it, through a small gap in the welds, darkness that seems too thick, too complete. And if you enhance the image, adjust the contrast just right, you can see something that might be eyes, or might be your imagination, watching from below. David Park disappeared 3 weeks after posting the photos. His apartment was found empty, but his neighbors reported hearing digging sounds from his unit in the days before he vanished. The landlord found holes in his floor, perfectly circular, going down through 3 stories of concrete into the earth below. The holes were filled with concrete, and the building was condemned. But sometimes at night, residents of nearby buildings report feeling vibrations in the ground, rhythmic and purposeful, like something huge breathing in the deep. The pit at Pickle Lake remains sealed, guarded, officially forgotten. But the earth remembers. And sometimes, in the small hours of the morning, the guards report sounds from below the steel cap. Sounds like singing, like calling, like something vast and patient, waiting for the seal to weaken, waiting to feed again. Story 3. The Vanishing of Violet Harbor, British Columbia. Violet Harbor existed on maps until 1992, a fishing village of about 300 people on a forgotten inlet of the Inside Passage. It was the kind of place you only found if you were lost or looking for it specifically. The only access was by boat or float plane, and even then, only when the notorious coastal fog lifted enough to navigate the treacherous waters. What happened to Violet Harbor remains officially unexplained. The RCMP file is classified. Witnesses were bound by legal agreements that prohibit them from discussing what they saw, and the location itself is now marked as a navigation hazard, off-limits to civilian vessels. But pieces of the story have emerged over the years, fragments of a horror that defies rational explanation. Linda Zhao was a marine biologist studying kelp forests along the BC coast that summer. She'd anchored her research vessel, the Persistent Dream, in Violet Harbor on July 15th to resupply and wait out a storm system. The village seemed normal that first evening. Fishermen mending nets, children playing on the docks, the smell of salmon smoking in the processing sheds. But something was off about the water. Linda's instruments detected unusual temperatures in the harbor, warmer than they should be, with pH levels that didn't match the surrounding ocean. The kelp forests that should have thrived in the protected inlet were absent, and the seafloor sonar showed formations that looked almost architectural, too regular, too purposeful to be natural. That night, Linda was awakened by singing, not from the village, but from the water itself. A harmonious sound that seemed to rise from the depths, beautiful and wrong in equal measure. She went on deck to investigate and saw lights beneath the surface, moving in patterns that reminded her of bioluminescent jellyfish, but far too organized, too deliberate. Other boats in the harbor were dark, their occupants apparently undisturbed. But when Linda looked toward the village, she saw people standing on the shore, dozens of them, fully clothed and perfectly still, staring at the water. They stood like statues in the moonlight, and she realized with growing horror that they weren't breathing. Their chests didn't move. No vapor came from their mouths in the cool air. She tried to radio the Coast Guard, but her equipment produced only static. Her satellite phone was dead. Even her emergency beacon failed to activate. As she watched, more villagers emerged from their homes, walking with synchronized steps toward, not stopping at the waterline but continuing forward, disappearing beneath the surface without a splash, without struggle. Children followed parents. Elderly couples walked hand in hand into the depths. And still that singing continued, growing louder, more complex, almost comprehensible. Linda found herself moving toward the rail of her boat, her hands reaching for the ladder, her mind filled with images of warmth and welcome and home. It took every ounce of her scientific training, her rational mind screaming against the compulsion to break away and lock herself in the wheelhouse. She started her engines, or tried to. The motor turned over but produced no thrust. Looking over the side, she saw why. The water around her hull had thickened to the consistency of gelatin, holding her vessel in place. And in that thickened water, shapes moved. Human shapes, but wrong. The villagers who'd walked into the harbor were down there, standing on the seafloor 30 feet below, their eyes open and reflecting light like a cat's, their mouths moving in unison with the singing. Dawn came late, filtered through fog so thick it seemed solid. The singing had stopped, replaced by silence so complete Linda could hear her own heartbeat. The water had returned to normal consistency, and her engines worked. But Violet Harbor was empty. Every building stood open, meals half-eaten on tables, television still playing to empty rooms. 300 people gone. Linda fled, pushing her vessel to its limits to escape the inlet. But as she navigated the passage out to open water, she saw them. The villagers were in the water, floating just below the surface, following her boat. Their eyes tracked her movement, but they made no effort to surface, no sign they needed air. They just watched, hundreds of faces beneath the waves, until she reached open ocean, and they finally fell back, returning to the harbor. The Coast Guard found Linda 12 hours later, her vessel drifting with engines at full throttle but going nowhere, circling the same GPS coordinates over and over. She was catatonic, had to be sedated and airlifted to Vancouver General. When she finally spoke, her story was dismissed as delusional, the result of a gas leak on her vessel causing hallucinations. But the Coast Guard cutter that investigated Violet Harbor found it exactly as Linda described. Empty, abandoned mid-activity, with no sign of violence or struggle. The official report cited mass evacuation due to unknown circumstances, but the personnel who wrote it noticed things they couldn't explain. the harbor water registered temperatures 15 degrees above normal. Divers reported feeling watched, and 2 refused to enter the water after their equipment detected massive biomass readings where nothing visible existed. Satellite imagery from July 16th showed something else. For exactly 3 minutes and 17 seconds, the entire inlet appeared to be covered by something dark and organic, like a massive organism surfacing. The images were classified, but a technician who saw them before they were sealed described it as looking like a throat opening. The government response was swift and absolute. Violet Harbor was declared a contaminated site, off-limits due to industrial toxins. The inlet was removed from navigation charts. Families of the missing were told their loved ones had died in a natural disaster and received settlements conditional on non-disclosure agreements. But fishermen in the area know to avoid those waters. They report nets that come up empty in areas that should teem with fish, report sounds on calm nights that don't belong to any known marine life, report seeing lights deep beneath their hulls that follow them until they leave the area. And sometimes, on very clear days when the water is still, they see them, the people of Violet Harbor, standing on the seafloor, unchanged by years underwater, waiting. Dr. Marcus Choi, an oceanographer who reviewed Linda's data before it was confiscated, noted that the temperature and chemical anomalies in Violet Harbor matched theoretical models for hydrothermal vents. But no vents should exist in that location. Unless, he speculated in notes that were later destroyed, something else was generating heat from below. Something biological, something massive. In 2007, a submarine drone conducting environmental monitoring in the area transmitted images before losing contact. The last frame showed what appeared to be buildings on the seafloor, not ruins, but intact structures that shouldn't exist, couldn't exist. And moving among them, figures that looked human, but moved with the fluid grace of marine creatures, tending to gardens of something that glowed with bioluminescent light. The drone was never recovered. The monitoring program was canceled. And Violet Harbor remains off-limits, a blank spot on maps where a village used to be. But on quiet nights, when the fog rolls in thick and the water is still, boats passing nearby report singing from beneath the waves. Beautiful singing that makes crews want to alter course, to investigate, to jump overboard and swim toward the sound. Those who've heard it and resisted describe the same thing, a promise of something beyond human experience, evolution accelerated, transformation into something new. They describe visions of a city beneath the waves, where the people of Violet Harbor live still, changed but alive, waiting for others to join them in their submarine paradise. Linda Zhao lives in Alberta now, as far from the ocean as she could get. She won't discuss what happened at Violet Harbor, won't even acknowledge she was ever there. But sometimes she wakes to find her bathtub filled with salt water, her feet wet with brine. And she knows that whatever took the village hasn't forgotten her, that it's waiting, patient as the tide, for her to return to the sea. Story 4. The underground children of Uranium City. Saskatchewan Uranium City died officially in 1982 when the mines closed, but something in that ghost town refused to stay dead. By 1996, only 70 people remained in what was once Saskatchewan's northernmost settlement, clinging to existence at the edge of the world. That's when the children started disappearing. Not all at once, not obviously. Just gaps where kids should be, explained away until the explanations ran out. Robert Ducharme was the town's only teacher, running a one-room schoolhouse for the dozen or so children whose parents couldn't or wouldn't leave. He noticed it first. Desks that should have been filled, attendance records that didn't match his memory. When he mentioned it to parents, they looked confused, claimed their children were at school, had been at school every day. But Robert knew better. He'd taught Tommy Sinclair for 3 years, knew the boy's struggle with reading, his love of hockey. Now Tommy's parents acted like he didn't exist, had never existed. His desk was gone, his records erased, his name absent from team photos that Robert knew had included him just weeks before. The RCMP detachment, one officer serving the whole region, dismissed Robert's concerns. Constable David Moore suggested stress, isolation, maybe early onset dementia. But Robert had proof. He'd kept copies of everything in his home filing cabinet, duplicates the mysterious erasure hadn't touched, photos showing children who were supposedly never real, report cards for students everyone claimed never existed. He started investigating on his own, mapping the disappearances. They centered on the abandoned Gunner Mine, a sprawling complex of tunnels and shafts that honeycombed the earth beneath the town. The mine had been sealed in 1982, its entrances collapsed or welded shut, warning signs posted about radiation and unstable ground. But Robert found evidence of recent activity: fresh tire tracks, disturbed earth, and most unsettling children's footprints leading to a ventilation shaft that should have been impassable. On a frigid October night, Robert followed those footprints. The shaft had been cleared from inside, the grate torn away with tremendous force. He descended using an old rope ladder someone had installed, his flashlight revealing walls that gleamed with residual uranium ore, making his Geiger counter click like an insect swarm. The mine should have been empty, flooded, collapsed. Instead, Robert found active passages, lit by a phosphorescent glow that seemed to emanate from the rocks themselves. The deeper he went, the warmer it became, until he was sweating in temperatures that should have been near freezing. He heard them before he saw them. Children's voices, laughing, playing. Following the sound through a maze of tunnels, he emerged into a vast cavern that shouldn't have existed, wasn't on any mining survey. And there they were, the missing children. Tommy Sinclair, Sarah Whitehorse, Michael Crane. A dozen others reported as never existed, or moved away, or died in infancy. But they were wrong. Changed. Their skin had a translucent quality, veins visible beneath like subcutaneous rivers of light. Their eyes had adapted to the darkness, pupils dilated to black circles that reflected his flashlight like mirrors. They moved wrong, too fluid, too quick, scaling the cavern walls with spider-like ease. "Mr. Ducharme," Tommy said, his voice harmonious, as if multiple people were speaking in unison. "You shouldn't have come. The parents above don't remember because it's kinder that way. We're better here. We're becoming something new." Behind the children, Robert saw it, the thing that had changed them. It crawled from a deeper tunnel, a mass of flesh and radiation, tumors given sentience, cancer evolved into consciousness. It had too many limbs, too many mouths, all of them speaking in the voices of children it had absorbed over the years, maybe decades. "The uranium woke it," Sarah explained, her child's voice terribly calm. "It was sleeping in the deep places, but the mining, the radiation, it fed on that, got strong, got smart, and it was lonely, so lonely. It called us, and we came, and now we're part of something bigger. We're its family now." The thing moved closer, and Robert felt it in his mind, a presence like static between radio stations, offering him communion, transformation, escape from the isolation and failure of the dying town above. He saw visions of what he could become, immortal, connected, never alone again. All he had to do was stay, let the radiation and the thing's biology remake him into something that could survive in this new ecosystem. Robert ran. The children didn't chase him. They just watched with sad, glowing eyes as he scrambled back through the tunnels, up the shaft, into the cold clarity of the surface world. He went straight to Constable Moore, babbling about monsters and missing children and things that shouldn't exist. Moore didn't arrest him. Instead, he made a phone call. Within hours, men in hazmat suits arrived from somewhere south, sealed the ventilation shaft with concrete, and had a long conversation with Robert that ended with him signing papers he wasn't allowed to read and accepting a generous early retirement package that required him to leave Uranium City immediately. But before he left, Robert did one thing. He mailed copies of his evidence to journalists, professors, anyone who might listen. Most dismissed it as the ravings of an isolated man cracking under pressure, but some investigated. They found anomalies, birth records that didn't match census data, graves for children who were supposedly alive, radiation readings around the old mine that spiked in patterns too regular to be natural. Dr. Patricia Kim, a radiobiologist from the University of Saskatchewan, analyzed soil samples from near the sealed mine in 2001. She found isotopes that shouldn't exist, DNA fragments that didn't match any known organism, and most disturbing, what appeared to be human genetic material that had been fundamentally altered at the chromosomal level. "Something is living down there," she wrote in notes that were never published. "Something that's learned to metabolize radiation, to use it as an energy source. And if these samples are accurate, it's incorporating human genetic material into itself, or vice versa. We may be looking at an entirely new form of life, one that's actively evolving in response to human activity." Her research was terminated, her funding pulled, her samples confiscated. But she remembers. And sometimes, when she reviews her hidden copies of the data, she wonders about those children in the mine. Are they still down there? Still changing? Still growing? Uranium City continues its slow death, population now below 30. The few remaining residents don't talk about the children who aren't there anymore, the families that never existed. But sometimes, on very quiet nights, they hear sounds from below. Laughter, singing, the voices of kids playing games in the dark. And every few years, another child disappears. Not dramatically, not violently. They just fade from memory, from records, from reality as the surface knows it. Their parents forget, their friends forget, the world forgets. But down in the warm darkness beneath Uranium City, in caverns that glow with their own light, they remember everything. They remember, and they wait, and they grow into something humanity isn't ready to understand. Robert Ducharme died in 2003 in a Toronto nursing home, insisting to the end that the children were real, that the thing in the mine was real, that Uranium City hid a secret that would reshape our understanding of life itself. His final words, according to the nurse who attended him, were, "They're not missing, they're becoming, and when they're ready, they'll come back for the rest of us." The mine remains sealed. The town continues to empty, and beneath the earth, something that was once children and is now something else entirely continues its patient evolution, feeding on radiation and solitude, building a civilization in the deep places where humanity fears to look. Story 5. The Night Shift at Fort Chipewyan, Alberta. Fort Chipewyan sits on the shore of Lake Athabasca, accessible only by plane in summer or ice road in winter. In November 1999, something happened at the town's small hospital that was never officially reported, never investigated, and never explained. The 7 people who witnessed it are bound by legal agreements that classify the event under the National Security Act. But trauma has a way of surfacing, and over the years, pieces of the story have emerged. Nancy Whitehorse had been a nurse for 15 years when she took the position at Fort Chipewyan General Hospital. The isolation didn't bother her. She'd grown up in the territories, understood the particular silence of the North. The hospital was small, just 20 beds, serving the town's 1,200 residents and the surrounding indigenous communities. The night of November 13th started normally. Nancy was working the graveyard shift with Dr. James Park, a recent medical school graduate from Edmonton serving his rural residency. They had 3 patients, an elderly man recovering from pneumonia, a woman who delivered a baby that morning, and 8-year-old Matthew Cardinal, who'd been brought in with what appeared to be severe anemia and symptoms no one could explain. Matthew had been sick for weeks. He was pale, wouldn't eat, and complained of dreams where something called to him from the lake. His grandmother, who'd raised him since his parents died, insisted it wasn't natural illness. She performed traditional ceremonies, burned sweetgrass, but nothing helped. Finally, desperate, she brought him to the hospital. At 2:17 a.m., the power went out. Not unusual in Fort Chipewyan, the generators kicked in within seconds. But something else happened in that brief darkness. When the emergency lights came on, Matthew was standing in the hallway, his hospital gown soaked despite having been in bed moments before. Water pooled around his feet, but not normal water. It was thick, viscous, and it smelled like something ancient and organic. "It's here," Matthew said, his 8-year-old voice carrying an authority that made Nancy's skin crawl. "It followed me from the lake. It wants to go home." Dr. Park approached the boy, but stopped when he saw Matthew's eyes. They'd changed. The irises had become silvered, reflective, like a fish's eyes. And behind Matthew, wet footprints led from his room to where he stood. But they weren't human footprints. They were webbed, too large, with marks that suggested claws. The temperature in the hospital dropped 20 degrees in seconds. Ice formed on the windows despite the heating system running. And then they heard it, a sound like breathing but wet, labored, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The new mother in room 3 started screaming. Nancy ran to check on her, while Dr. Park stayed with Matthew. She found the woman pressed against the far wall, pointing at her newborn's bassinet. The baby was fine, sleeping peacefully, but standing over it was something that shouldn't exist. It had the basic shape of a human, but stood 7 feet tall. Its skin was translucent gray-green, like lake ice over deep water. Through its chest, Nancy could see organs that weren't quite right. Too many hearts, lungs that looked like gills, a digestive system that seemed to be processing something that glowed. Its face was the worst part, almost human, but elongated, with a mouth that opened too wide, and eyes that held an intelligence that was both alien and familiar. The thing turned to Nancy, and when it spoke, its voice sounded like drowning, like the last breath before going under. "The child called us. The old agreement is broken. The lake remembers what the land forgets." Nancy grabbed the baby and ran. Behind her, she heard the thing following, its wet footsteps slapping against the linoleum. She burst into the hallway to find chaos. More of them had appeared, emerging from pools of that viscous water that seemed to generate spontaneously. Dr. Park was backed against a wall, Matthew standing between him and 3 of the creatures, the boy speaking in a language that sounded like waves against stone. The elderly patient, John Mercer, was standing in his doorway, holding an old rifle Nancy didn't know he had. "My grandfather told me about them," he said, his voice steady despite the madness around them. "The water people. They made a pact with the indigenous peoples generations ago. Stay in the deep places, don't take more than offered. But the oil sands, the pollution, it's killing the lake. They're dying, and they blame us." One of the creatures moved toward John, and he fired. The bullet passed through it like it was made of water, but the thing screamed, a sound that shattered every piece of glass in the hallway. It retreated, rejoining the others who surrounded Matthew. "Give us the child," they said in unison. "He carries the old blood. Through him, we can survive. Through him, We can adapt, or we all die together. Your kind and ours. Matthew's grandmother appeared in the emergency entrance, though the doors had been locked. She looked ancient in that moment, carrying knowledge that predated the hospital, the town, maybe even humanity, as Nancy understood it. She spoke in Dean, and the creatures responded in kind, a negotiation in languages Nancy couldn't comprehend. Finally, the grandmother turned to Dr. Park. The boy has to choose. It's in his blood. His great-great-grandfather was a shaman who walked between worlds. He can bridge our species, but only if he chooses. Force him either way, and both sides lose. Matthew looked at the creatures, then at the humans. 8 years old, bearing a weight no child should carry. When he spoke, his voice was his own again. I'll go with them for the winter. Learn what they need. Come spring, I'll return with answers. But if either side breaks this peace, everyone dies. The creatures moved toward Matthew, and Nancy wanted to stop them, but the grandmother held her back. The boy walked into their midst, and as he did, his form began to change. His skin took on that translucent quality, his eyes silvered completely. But he was still Matthew, still human, just more now. Remember, one of the creatures said to the room, the lake is dying. Fix it, or we surface. All of us. And there are thousands of us, waiting in the deep places, in every lake, every river from here to the Arctic Ocean. They left the way they'd come, dissolving into pools of water that evaporated within minutes. Matthew went with them, walking into a puddle and disappearing like he'd never existed. The power came back on. The ice on the windows melted, and 7 people stood in a destroyed hospital hallway, trying to process what they'd witnessed. The government response was swift. Within hours, officials arrived, classified the event, and began cleanup. The official story was a chemical leak that caused hallucinations. Everyone present was relocated, given generous compensation, and required to sign documents that made discussing the event a federal crime. But Matthew's grandmother refused to leave Fort Chipewyan. Every spring, she goes to the lake's edge and waits. She's seen him twice, a boy who's not quite a boy anymore, standing waist-deep in water, watching the town with eyes that reflect like mirrors. He doesn't speak, doesn't approach, but she knows he's keeping his promise, maintaining the peace between worlds. Nancy Whitehorse lives in Vancouver now, works in a downtown hospital where she's never alone, never near large bodies of water. But sometimes, during night shifts, when pipes gurgle in the walls, she remembers that voice. The lake remembers what the land forgets. And she wonders how many lakes there are in Canada, how many deep places where things that aren't quite human wait for promises to be broken. Dr. Park disappeared in 2003, last seen walking toward Lake Ontario in Toronto. Security cameras showed him entering the water fully clothed at 3 a.m. He never surfaced. But a week later, his colleague received a postcard with no postmark, just a water stain and 2 words. They're everywhere. The oil sands continue to expand. The lakes continue to change. And somewhere in the deep waters of Lake Athabasca, a boy who chose to become something else maintains a fragile peace that most of humanity doesn't know exists. For now. Story 6. The Forgotten Students of Resolute Bay, Nunavut. In the permanent darkness of Arctic winter 2001, Resolute Bay's only school became a tomb for innocence. With a population of barely 200, Canada's second northernmost community clings to existence on Cornwallis Island, where the sun disappears for 4 months and temperatures drop to -50. That December, during the longest night, something ancient woke up in the permafrost beneath the school. Marcus Tutu was the night janitor, a 60-year-old Inuk elder who'd lived through the forced relocation of his people to this desolate place in the 1950s. He knew the land's moods, its dangers, its secrets. but nothing prepared him for what he found when he arrived for his shift on December 21st. The school should have been empty. Classes had ended hours ago, the teachers gone home, the students safe in their houses. But Marcus heard voices from the basement, children singing in Inuktitut. But the words were wrong, ancient, from dialects that hadn't been spoken for centuries. He found them in the boiler room. 23 students, aged 6 to 16, standing in a perfect circle around a hole that shouldn't exist. The concrete floor had been torn open from below, revealing black ice that gleamed with its own light. The children's eyes were closed, their mouths moving in perfect synchronization, and their breath came out in clouds that didn't dissipate but gathered above them, forming shapes that hurt to perceive. "Annie?" Marcus called to his granddaughter, one of the students in the circle. She didn't respond, didn't break the rhythm of the chant. He stepped closer and saw that their feet weren't touching the ground. They hovered inches above the floor, held by something invisible, something that made the air itself feel thick and wrong. Then he saw what was in the hole. It wasn't ice at the bottom, it was flesh, preserved in permafrost for God knows how long. Something massive, with skin like leather and eyes that shouldn't be able to open but did, focusing on Marcus with an intelligence older than human memory. The thing spoke through the children, 23 young voices layered into something that sounded like the earth itself groaning. "We were here before the ice, before your kind walked upright. The cold put us to sleep, but the warm blood above wakes us. These young ones, their dreams are so vivid, so warm. Through them, we remember what it is to live." Marcus backed towards the door, but it slammed shut. The temperature dropped so fast his next breath came out as ice crystals. The thing in the pit was rising, using the children's combined life force to pull itself from permafrost that had been its prison for millennia. He did the only thing he could think of. He began singing. Not the corrupted chant the children were voicing, but an old song his grandmother had taught him. A protection song from before the relocations, before the residential schools tried to beat the culture out of them. His voice was cracked, desperate, but true. The thing in the pit writhed. The children's synchronized chanting faltered. Annie's eyes snapped open, and for a moment, she was herself again. "Grandfather," she whispered, "it's so cold, but also warm. It wants to show us things from before. We could live forever like it does. We just have to let it in." "That's not living," Marcus said, continuing his song between words. "That's just existing. Come back, Annie. All of you, come back." The thing surged upward, and Marcus saw it fully. It had been human once, maybe, or something that evolved alongside humans. But time and cold and isolation had changed it into something else. Its body was segmented like an insect's, but covered in that ancient leather skin. Too many arms, all of them reaching for the children. A face that was almost human, but stretched and distorted, with a mouth that opened vertically and horizontally, revealing rows of teeth like icicles. But Marcus's song was working. The other children were waking up, their hovering forms dropping to the floor. The thing screamed, a sound like glaciers breaking, and began to sink back into its pit. But as it went, it spoke one more time. "The ice is melting. All over the world the ice is melting. We are millions, sleeping in the permafrost, waiting. Your warmth will wake us all, and when we rise, we will remember what your kind did to the world that was ours first." The pit began to close, the black ice flowing like liquid to seal the opening. But before it closed completely, the thing reached out and touched 3 of the children, Annie, young David Kanguk, and 15-year-old Sarah Akneviak. They screamed, and where it touched them, their skin turned that same leather texture, their eyes took on that ancient gleam. Then it was gone. The floor was solid concrete again, no sign of the hole. The children collapsed, most unconscious but breathing. But Annie, David, and Sarah stood still, changed. They looked human, but Marcus could see the difference. They moved too smoothly, blinked too rarely, and when they spoke, sometimes other voices seemed to echo beneath their own. The RCMP flew in from Iqaluit, then the military, then people in suits who didn't identify themselves. The official story was a gas leak causing mass hallucinations. The school was closed for renovations that included pouring 10 feet of reinforced concrete in the basement and installing monitoring equipment that no one would explain. The unchanged children were treated and released, their memories fuzzy, officially attributed to carbon monoxide exposure. But Annie, David, and Sarah were different. They were taken south for specialized treatment. Their families told they had a rare condition requiring quarantine. Marcus fought for his granddaughter, demanded answers, but was met with legal documents and veiled threats. 3 months later, the 3 children returned, but they weren't the same. They attended school, played, laughed, but it was performance. Marcus caught Annie once, standing at her bedroom window at 3 a.m., staring north toward the school, her breath fogging the glass in patterns that looked like writing in no human language. "It's still there, grandfather," she said without turning around. "Sleeping again, but lighter now. And there are so many others, under the whole Arctic, under Antarctica, under every place where ice has kept them sleeping. But the ice is going away. Every year, a little more melts. And when it's gone..." She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Marcus had seen the climate reports, the retreating glaciers, the thawing permafrost. He understood what she meant, what they all were going to mean. The 3 changed children grew up, left Resolute Bay, dispersed across Canada. But they keep in touch in ways that aren't quite normal. Knowing things about each other they shouldn't know. Showing up in the same places without planning. Always heading north when summer comes. Drawn back toward the Arctic like migrating birds. Dr. Rebecca Chen, who studied the children during their quarantine, kept unauthorized notes that leaked after her death in 2009. She wrote, "Whatever touched them left something behind. Their DNA shows markers that shouldn't exist, chromosomes that appear to be millions of years old. They're still human, but they're also something else. Ambassadors, maybe? Or scouts? They say they dream of cities under the ice, of civilizations that predate any fossil record. And the worst part is, I believe them." In 2019, construction workers renovating the now abandoned school broke through the reinforced concrete by accident. They found monitoring equipment still running, still recording. The data showed regular pulses from below, like a heartbeat, but too slow, once every 3 days. And the temperature readings showed something impossible, a heat source 30 feet below the permafrost, warm enough that it should have melted everything around it, but somehow contained. The workers resealed the breach and left Resolute Bay that same day. The school remains abandoned, officially condemned. But locals report seeing lights in the basement windows sometimes, hearing children singing in languages that predate human speech. And every year, as the permafrost thaws a little more, the thing below stirs in its sleep, waiting for the ice that imprisons it to finally, inevitably, melt away. Marcus Tutu still lives in Resolute Bay, still watches his granddaughter when she visits, still sings the old protection songs. But he knows they're just delays, not solutions. The ice is melting. The ancient things are waking. And humanity has no idea what's been sleeping beneath their feet for millions of years, waiting for the warm-blooded species above to change the climate, just enough to set them free. Story 7. The Congregation of Crow's Nest Pass, Alberta. The town of Coleman in the Crow's Nest Pass had been dying slowly since the coal mines closed. But in the winter of 2003, it died in a different way altogether. Among the 1,400 residents, a secret congregation formed that promised salvation, but delivered something far more terrible. Rachel Morrison was the new RCMP constable, transferred from Calgary to this mountain town on the Alberta-British Columbia border. She'd requested the remote posting after a difficult divorce, seeking peace in the isolation. Instead, she found a community gripped by something that wore the mask of religious fervor, but underneath was purely predatory. It started with missing persons reports that weren't quite right. People would vanish for days, then return with no memory of leaving, but changed. Subtly at first. An accountant who suddenly spoke Latin, a child who could predict weather patterns with disturbing accuracy, an elderly woman whose arthritis disappeared overnight, but whose eyes had turned completely black for 3 days before returning to normal. The local churches reported declining attendance. Father Miguel at St. Paul's Catholic Church was particularly concerned. "They're going somewhere else," he told Rachel. "Sunday mornings, Wednesday evenings. I see them walking toward the old Green Hill Mine Road, dressed in their finest clothes, but there's nothing up there but abandoned mining facilities." Rachel investigated, driving the winding mountain road on a Wednesday evening in November. She found cars parked along the roadside, dozens of them, but no people. Following footprints in the snow, she discovered a trail leading to the abandoned Green Hill Mine No. 2, sealed since a collapse in 1958 that killed 15 miners. The entrance had been opened from the inside. She could hear singing from deep in the mine, hymns she didn't recognize in a language that sounded like English but wrong, as if the words were being spoken backward and forward simultaneously. Against every protocol, she entered alone. The passages were lit with candles that burned without consuming, their flames unnaturally still despite air currents in the tunnels. She found them in a vast chamber that shouldn't exist according to mining surveys. Over 100 townspeople stood in concentric circles around a pool of black water that reflected no light. At the center, on a natural stone platform, stood Peter Blackwood, a man who'd arrived in Coleman 6 months earlier claiming to be a traveling preacher. But as Rachel watched, she realized Peter Blackwood wasn't human. His shadow moved independently of his body, reaching out to touch the congregation, and where it touched, people convulsed in what looked like ecstasy or agony. His voice carried harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce, and when he turned slightly, Rachel saw that beneath his suit, his body seemed to be composed of something that writhed and shifted. "Brothers and sisters," Blackwood spoke, his voice resonating in frequencies that made Rachel's teeth ache. "The time of transformation is upon us. The old gods are dead, but new ones rise from the deep places. We are chosen to be their vessels, their prophets, their food." The congregation responded in unison. "We offer ourselves to the hunger that never ends." Rachel watched in horror as people she knew, the town banker, the school principal, her own neighbor, walked forward and knelt at the edge of the black pool. Something rose from the water, tentacles or roots or veins, she couldn't tell, and entered them through their mouths, eyes, any opening it could find. They didn't scream. They sang louder, their voices changing, becoming something that harmonized with the sound of the mountain itself groaning. She tried to back away, but her foot knocked loose a stone. Every head in the congregation turned toward her in perfect synchronization. Blackwood smiled, and his face split open vertically, revealing rows of teeth that spiraled down his throat like a staircase. "Constable Morrison," he said, somehow speaking clearly despite his bisected face. "You've come to join us. Everyone joins us eventually. Coleman belongs to the underneath now." Rachel ran. Behind her, she heard pursuit, not footsteps, but something wet and heavy dragging through the tunnels. She burst from the mine to find her patrol car surrounded by townspeople who hadn't been in the mine, their eyes reflecting the moonlight like animals. They didn't attack, just watched as she got in her vehicle and fled. She called for backup from the Coleman detachment, but the officer who answered sounded wrong, his voice carrying those same impossible harmonics. "Everything is fine, Constable Morrison. Come to the station. We'll discuss your concerns. The congregation would like to hear them." Rachel drove straight to Calgary, not stopping until she reached the provincial headquarters. Her report should have triggered a massive response, but the senior officers who debriefed her seemed skeptical. A psychiatric evaluation was ordered. The psychologist assigned to her case was Dr. Emma Blackwood, Peter Blackwood's wife, though Rachel hadn't known he was married. "My husband does such good work," Dr. Blackwood said, her smile too wide, her eyes unblinking. "He brings communities together, makes them whole. You should return to Coleman, Constable. Your congregation misses you." Rachel fled the office, went into hiding. But over the following weeks, she discovered the truth was worse than she'd imagined. The congregation wasn't limited to Coleman. There were branches in Pincher Creek, Fernie, Sparwood, every town along the Crow's Nest Pass. And it was spreading, carried by people who attended services and left changed, carrying something inside them that wasn't quite infection, wasn't quite possession, but was certainly not human. She tried media, but journalists who investigated either disappeared or returned to dismiss the story as rural folklore. She contacted other RCMP officers, but discovered many had attended services themselves. The congregation was spreading through official channels, converting from within. The last reliable report Rachel filed was in January 2004. She'd discovered that the Green Hill Mine No. 2 connected to a natural cave system that extended throughout the Rocky Mountains. Geological surveys from the 1950s, classified after the mine collapse, showed that the miners hadn't died in a cave-in. They'd broken through into something prehistoric, a pocket ecosystem that had been sealed for millions of years. The 15 miners were never found because they never died. They became the first congregation, transformed by whatever lived in those depths, and they'd been recruiting ever since. Peter Blackwood wasn't their leader. He was their newest face, their method of spreading beyond the mountains into populated areas. Rachel's final message, sent to a friend in the military, read, "They're not taking over, they're converting. Every person who attends becomes a door for something else to enter our world." Coleman is gone. The pass is gone. They're moving toward Calgary and Vancouver simultaneously. The collapse wasn't an accident in 1958. It was an attempt to seal them in. Someone knew. Someone tried to stop it. They failed. Rachel Morrison officially disappeared on January 15th, 2004. Her vehicle was found at the base of a cliff in the Rockies, but her body was never recovered. The investigation was closed quickly, ruled a probable suicide. But hikers in the Crow's Nest Pass sometimes report seeing her, standing at old mine entrances at dawn, trying to warn people away. She looks different now. Her skin has that translucent quality. Her eyes reflect light in spectrum humans shouldn't see. She's fighting something, they say, holding something back. She stands guard at the doorways between worlds, 1 foot in each, preventing full convergence. Coleman continues to exist on maps, populated by people who seem normal during daylight hours. But on Wednesday evenings and Sunday mornings, they gather, they sing, they transform. And piece by piece, person by person, they spread their congregation across Alberta, British Columbia, and beyond. The Green Hill Mine No. 2 is sealed again, officially, but locals know the seal is just for show. The real entrance is everywhere now, in churches, basements, wherever the congregation gathers to sing their impossible hymns and open doorways in human flesh for things that have been waiting in the deep places since before humanity existed. Story 8. The Ice Fishers of Lake Winnipeg, Manitoba. February 2005 brought the coldest winter Lake Winnipeg had seen in 50 years. The ice grew thick enough to drive trucks on, and ice fishing shacks dotted the frozen surface like a temporary town. But that winter, fishermen started pulling things from beneath the ice that shouldn't exist, and by the time anyone understood the danger, 17 people had vanished into holes that appeared and disappeared without warning. Carl Johansson had been ice fishing Lake Winnipeg for 30 years. He knew every bay, every depth, every spot where the walleye gathered. But that February, his lines kept snagging on something massive moving beneath the ice, something that bent his strongest rods and snapped 100-pound test line like thread. Other fishermen reported similar experiences. Worse, the fish they did catch were wrong. Walleye with extra eyes arranged in patterns that looked deliberate. Perch whose scales formed symbols that hurt to look at directly. And once, just once, something that looked like a human hand until you saw the webbing between fingers that were too long, too jointed, with nails that were closer to claws. The first disappearance happened on February 12th. Mike Whitecloud, fishing alone in his shack 2 miles from shore, simply vanished. His shack was found intact, heater still running, coffee still warm. But the ice fishing hole had expanded to 6 feet across, its edges smooth as glass, and the water below was black in a way that seemed to absorb light. Search and rescue found no body, no signs of struggle. But they did find something else. Tracks under the ice, visible through the clear, frozen water, as if something huge had walked along the lake bottom directly beneath Mike's shack, then ascended. 3 days later, 2 more fishermen disappeared. Then a family of 4. Each time, the same signature. Enlarged holes, smooth edges, black water that didn't reflect anything, and those tracks beneath the ice leading to and from each site. Conservation Officer Diana Blackfoot was assigned to investigate, initially suspecting elaborate murder or insurance fraud. But what she discovered in the victims' fishing shacks defied rational explanation. Each shack contained drawings, sketched frantically on whatever was available. Napkins, bait containers, even carved into the wooden walls. The drawings showed the same thing. A city beneath the lake, populated by figures that were almost human, but elongated, adapted for underwater life, and ancient beyond measure. More disturbing were the words written alongside the drawings, all in different handwriting but conveying the same message. They're coming up. The ice is a door. They remember when the lake was theirs. They want it back. Diana interviewed surviving witnesses, fishermen who'd been near the disappearance sites. Their stories were consistent and impossible. They'd seen lights under the ice, too organized to be natural, moving in formations that suggested intelligence. They'd heard voices calling from below, speaking names of people who'd drowned in the lake decades ago. And they'd felt something that terrified them more than the rest, a presence in their minds, ancient and patient, offering them eternity beneath the waves if they'd just step through the ice. On February 20th, Diana witnessed it herself. She was investigating a disappearance site when the ice beneath her feet became transparent. Not thin, but clear as glass. And through it, she saw Lake Winnipeg's bottom. But it wasn't the muddy, empty lake bed she expected. There were structures down there, buildings of impossible architecture, twisted spires that hurt to perceive, and, moving among them, beings that had once been human. She recognized Mike Whitecloud, but transformed. His body was elongated, fingers webbed, skin taking on the blue-green hue of deep water. He looked up at her through the clear ice and smiled with too many teeth. He pressed his hand against the ice from below, and where he touched, words appeared in frost. Join us. The drowning is temporary. The life below is forever. Diana ran, but the clear ice followed her, spreading like an infection. Through it, she saw more of the transformed. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all people who'd vanished from Lake Winnipeg over the years. They were building something down there, constructing devices of no recognizable purpose, preparing for something. She made it to shore and immediately contacted authorities. But when she returned with a response team, the ice was normal again, opaque and thick. The fishing shacks were empty. No unusual holes. No evidence except Diana's testimony and the drawings found in the shacks. The military arrived within days, establishing a perimeter around the lake, claiming a toxic spill required evacuation. But Diana saw what they pulled from the water. Bodies that weren't quite bodies, technology that couldn't exist, and once, something alive that took 6 men to subdue, screaming in a language that predated human speech about the bargain broken and the surface world's time ending. Dr. Marcus Chen, a xenobiologist brought in from Toronto, shared his findings with Diana before being silenced by security protocols. The beings under Lake Winnipeg weren't invaders or monsters. They were humans, or had been, transformed by something that had lived in the lake since before recorded history. Carbon dating on recovered artifacts suggested a civilization over 10,000 years old, predating known human settlement in the area. They're not taking people, Dr. Chen explained. They're recruiting. Every person who goes through the ice is given a choice: drown or transform. Most choose transformation. And each one who changes adds to their workforce, their army, whatever they're building down there. The ice fishing season was canceled. The lake was closed to all traffic. But Diana knew it was temporary. The beings below were patient. They'd waited 10,000 years. They could wait longer. And every winter, when the ice formed thick enough, they'd make their offer again. Before the military lockdown was complete, Diana received one final message. It appeared in frost on her office window. The lake remembers when there was no surface, when water covered everything. It will again. We're just preparing the way. Lake Winnipeg was reopened to limited fishing in 2007, the toxic spill story having served its purpose. But the old-timers don't fish there anymore. They know what's waiting below. And sometimes, on the coldest nights when the ice is thickest, people report seeing lights beneath the surface. Cities of light in the deep. Places and shadows of things that were once human beckoning from below. Patient as the lake itself, waiting for the ice to form just right, waiting to make their offer again. The disappeared were never found. Their families were compensated, told they'd drowned, bodies unrecoverable. But Diana knows better. She's seen them through the ice. They're not dead. They're transformed, living in a civilization older than recorded history, preparing for something that makes her wake in cold sweats. And every winter, despite the danger, despite the warnings, people disappear on Lake Winnipeg. The hole appears perfectly round, edges smooth as glass. The black water calls, and someone always answers, choosing transformation over death, eternity over ending, the deep over the surface. Story 9. The school bus of Twilling, Newfoundland. The morning of March 8, 2006, started with fog so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead, common enough in the fishing town of Twilling. But when school bus number 47 picked up its regular load of 23 children and disappeared into that fog, it entered something that wasn't quite the Newfoundland everyone knew. Betty Parsons had driven that route for 12 years. She knew every pothole, every turn, every stop where children waited in the dim morning light. The bus left the depot at 7:15 a.m., right on schedule. It should have arrived at Twilling Elementary by 7:45. It didn't arrive until 8:30, and when it did, something fundamental had changed about everyone aboard. Principal John Murphy was the first to notice something wrong. The children filed off the bus in perfect silence, moving in synchronized steps like a military unit. Their eyes were focused on something beyond normal sight, and when they breathed, their exhalations came out cold despite the warming morning air. "Where were you, Betty?" John asked the driver, but Betty just stared through him, her hands still gripping the wheel as if she was still driving through something only she could see. The children entered the school and went to their classrooms, but they wouldn't speak, wouldn't engage with lessons, wouldn't eat lunch. They sat at their desks, hands folded, breathing in unison, waiting for something. When teachers tried to call parents, they discovered all the children's emergency contact numbers had been disconnected, as if the families had vanished. Nurse Patricia O'Brien examined the children and found their body temperatures were 5 degrees below normal. Their heart rates synchronized at exactly 40 beats per minute. And most disturbing, when she looked into their eyes with her pen light, she saw not the expected pupil dilation, but something else. A depth that seemed to go on forever, containing stars that shouldn't exist. The RCMP were called. Constable David Reed interviewed Betty Parsons, who had finally started speaking, though what she said made no sense. "We drove the usual route," she insisted, "but the fog took us somewhere else. Somewhere the road split into possibilities, and we had to choose which reality to follow back." She described impossible things. Streets that existed between the streets everyone knew, houses that were there and not there simultaneously, and people watching from windows. People who looked like the children on the bus, but older, sadder, wearing clothes from different eras, all trying to wave warnings the bus passengers couldn't understand. "We picked up other children," Betty said, her voice hollow. Children who'd been waiting in that fog for years, decades maybe. They got on the bus, but when we came back to the real Twilling gate, they couldn't follow. They had to stay in the between place. But they left something with our children. A memory, a purpose, a message. The children remained silent until exactly 3:33 p.m. Then all 23 spoke in unison, their voices layered into something that sounded like a chorus of ages. "The town is built on a threshold. Every fog opens the door. We've seen what's on the other side. It's not empty. It's full of everyone who ever got lost in the fog, everyone who chose the wrong turn, everyone who disappeared. They're trying to come home, but home has forgotten them." Then the children collapsed. When they woke, most claimed no memory of the missing time. But they were changed. They drew obsessively. Pictures of Twilling Gate, but different, with extra streets, additional houses, and people who didn't exist in any census. They spoke of friends who weren't in their classes, used names of children who disappeared in fogs dating back generations. Local historian Margaret Stone recognized some of the names. She'd researched Twilling Gate's unusual history of disappearances, people who walked into fog banks and never emerged, fishing boats that sailed out of the harbor and vanished despite calm seas, and yes, a school bus in 1967 that disappeared with 19 children aboard, never found. The affected children began sleepwalking, always during fog, always toward the harbor. Parents would find them standing at the edge of the water, talking to nothing, negotiating with voices only they could hear. "They want to trade places," one child explained. "The lost ones. One of us for one of them. That's the only way they can come back." 3 weeks after the incident, during another thick fog, 7-year-old Timothy Walsh disappeared from his bedroom. His window was locked from the inside, no sign of struggle. But his parents found a note in handwriting that looked like his, but older, more mature. "I chose to go. Someone had to. Sarah from 1967 is taking my place. She promises to be a good daughter. Please love her like you loved me." The next morning, a girl appeared at the Walsh house. She looked exactly like Timothy's sister would have, if he'd had a sister. She knew the family, knew the house, had memories of growing up there. The parents, horrified and desperate, almost accepted the fiction. But blood tests revealed the impossible. She was genetically their daughter, but born in 1960, chronologically impossible, yet medically verified. The town tried to contain the situation, but more trades happened. Children who'd ridden bus 47 that morning would disappear in fog, replaced by children from other times who knew everything about the families they joined, but were fundamentally wrong, out of place, carrying knowledge and memories from Twilling gates that existed parallel to, but separate from the real one. Dr. Lisa Chen, a physicist from Memorial University, proposed a theory that Twilling Gate sat on a quantum threshold, a place where parallel realities touched during certain atmospheric conditions. The fog didn't cause the phenomenon, but revealed it, allowed passage between versions of the town that had diverged at various points in history. Every time someone disappears in the fog, she explained, they don't cease to exist. They shift to another version of Twilling Gate, almost identical but not quite. And in that other Twilling Gate, they become the lost ones, trying to find their way back to their original reality. The school bus itself became evidence of this theory. When examined closely, it contained impossible artifacts: a student ID card for a school that was never built, a lunchbox with a thermos manufactured by a company that never existed, and most unsettling, a logbook showing the same route driven every day for 40 years by Betty Parsons, who had only been driving for 12. The town adapted, as small towns do. Warning sirens were installed for heavy fog days. Children who'd been on bus 47 were monitored, kept indoors when visibility dropped. But the trades continued, less frequently but never stopping. Families learned to accept the replacements, these children from parallel Twilling gates who were their children but weren't, who carried memories of lives almost but not quite the ones they should have lived. Betty Parsons retired immediately after the incident, but she never left Twilling Gate. She spends her days watching the fog, waiting. I can see them sometimes, she tells anyone who will listen. All the buses that have driven that route, in all the different Twilling gates, all picking up children who exist and don't exist, all trying to find their way back to the right reality. And I know that somewhere, another Betty Parsons is driving my route, in my bus, wondering how she ended up in the wrong town. The elementary school keeps a memorial for the missing children, though officially they're listed as transferred to other schools. But teachers know the truth. They've seen the wrong children in their classes, children who know the lessons but learned them differently, children who remember teachers who never existed, children who wait for fog days with anticipation and dread, knowing they might be called to trade places with another version of themselves. And bus number 47 still runs the same route every morning, though drivers report strange things, extra stops that aren't on the map, children waiting who aren't on the roster, and sometimes, just sometimes, the reflection in the rearview mirror shows a bus full of children who aren't quite the ones who got on, all of them staring forward into a fog that exists in more than one reality, all of them traveling toward a school that exists in every version of Twilling Gate, all of them hoping this time they'll arrive in the right one. Story 10. The Lighthouse Keeper of Peggy's Cove, Nova Scotia. Peggy's Cove Lighthouse stopped needing a keeper in 1958 when it was automated, but in October 2008, locals started seeing someone in the lighthouse at night, tending to a flame that shouldn't exist, sending signals that didn't match any maritime code, and always watching the sea with eyes that reflected light, like a nocturnal animal. Sharon McDonald, a marine biologist studying tidal pools around the famous tourist destination, was first to document the anomaly. She'd been conducting nighttime observations when she noticed the lighthouse beam behaving strangely, not sweeping in its programmed pattern, but focusing on specific spots in the ocean, tracking something beneath the waves. She climbed the rocks to investigate, finding the lighthouse door not just unlocked but standing open, though Parks Canada insisted it had been sealed for the season. Inside, the automated systems were functioning normally, but alongside them, someone had installed older equipment: oil lamps, telegraph keys, and most disturbing, glass containers filled with seawater that housed things that pulsed with bioluminescent light. At the top of the lighthouse stood a man who shouldn't exist. Harold Hensley, according to the logbooks she later found, had been the last human keeper of Peggy's Cove lighthouse. He'd disappeared in December 1958, the night before the automation was complete, assumed swept out to sea by a rogue wave. But here he stood, 50 years later, unchanged except for his eyes, which had developed a nictitating membrane like a seal's, and his fingers, which were elongated and showed the beginning of webbing. "You shouldn't be here," Harold said, his voice carrying the cadence of waves against rocks. "Not tonight. They're coming to collect what was promised, and witnesses complicate the transaction." Before Sharon could respond, the sea below began to glow. Not the gentle phosphorescence of disturbed plankton, but an organized, intelligent light that moved in patterns beneath the surface. Through the lighthouse lens, she saw them clearly. Beings that swam like humans but breathed water, their bodies evolved for oceanic life, their eyes huge to capture light in the deep places. "My grandfather made the bargain in 1847, Harold explained, his hands working controls that shouldn't exist, sending light signals to the things below. The sea people, the deepeners they call themselves, saved his ship from wrecking on these rocks. In exchange, one from each generation of Hensleys must serve as keeper, not of the lighthouse but of the treaty. We watch for ships that need saving, and in exchange, we provide them with what they need from the surface world." Sharon watched in horror as containers rose from the water without any visible mechanism lifting them. They floated to the lighthouse as if carried by invisible hands, depositing themselves on the rocks. Inside were things that shouldn't exist in the ocean: documents, electronics, and disturbingly, what looked like human genetic material preserved in specialized containers. "They're learning," Harold said. "Studying us. Preparing for something. The ocean is dying, you see. Your kind poisoned it with plastics, chemicals, noise. The deepeners are adapting, evolving to survive what's coming. But they need our knowledge, our technology, our biology to complete their transformation." The beings in the water surfaced partially, and Sharon saw faces that were almost human but elongated, adapted for hydrodynamics. They spoke in harmonics that bypassed the ears and resonated directly in bones, offering visions of cities beneath the Atlantic, of civilizations that existed parallel to humanity, but hidden in trenches no submarine could reach. One of them fixed its gaze on Sharon, and she felt its consciousness touch hers. It showed her the history: ships saved from certain destruction, crews who chose to go below rather than drown, families like the Hensleys who maintained the covenant between surface and depth. But it also showed her the future: oceans rising, cities flooding, and humanity faced with a choice: evolve or drown. "Your generation will be the last to live solely on land," the being communicated without words. "We offer adaptation, survival, evolution. Those who refuse will join the geological record. Those who accept will inherit both earth and sea." Harold handed Sharon a leather journal, its pages warped by salt water but still readable. "Every keeper documents what they see. The government knows. They've always known. Why do you think they really automated the lighthouses? Not to save money, but to break the treaties, to stop the exchanges. But you can't break bargains made with the sea. It remembers everything, every promise, every debt." The journal contained entries dating back to 1847, each keeper documenting their encounters with the deepeners. ships saved in exchange for knowledge, drowning sailors who chose transformation over death, children born to human mothers but showing aquatic adaptations, hidden away or given to the sea. The most recent entries were heralds, but dated 2008, not 1958. He'd been keeping the lighthouse for 50 years, aging slowly, changing gradually, becoming something between human and deepener. Time moves differently below, he explained. I've lived centuries in their cities, learned their sciences, their arts, but I always return here, to tend the light, to maintain the treaty. Sharon tried to leave, but found herself unable to move beyond the lighthouse. The deepener's consciousness held her, not threatening but insistent. They had an offer for her, they communicated. Become the new keeper. Document the changes coming. Help humanity prepare for the inevitable merger of land and sea. I refused at first too, Harold said, but then they showed me what's coming. The ice caps melting completely, ocean currents stopping, mass extinction. They're not causing it. We are. They're just preparing to inherit what remains, and they're offering us a chance to inherit it with them. Sharon spent 3 days in the lighthouse, time that passed like minutes or centuries depending on her perception. The deepeners taught her their history, how they diverged from humanity millennia ago, choosing the ocean over land, evolving in the deep places, while surface humans forgot they existed. They showed her their cities, their technologies based on biology rather than machinery, their societies that had solved problems humanity was only beginning to recognize. On the third night, she made her choice. Not to become keeper, but to become witness. She would return to the surface world, document what she'd learned, prepare others for what was coming. The deepeners agreed, but marked her. Her eyes developed the same reflective quality as Harold's, her dreams filled with oceanic vistas, and she could hear their songs in every drop of rain. Harold remains at Peggy's Cove lighthouse, visible only to those who know to look, tending lights that exist in spectrums human eyes can't normally perceive. Tourist photos sometimes capture him, a figure in the lighthouse that shouldn't be there, dismissed as pareidolia or processing errors. But he's real as the treaty he maintains, as real as the beings that wait in the Atlantic depths. Sharon published her research on tidal pool adaptations, but embedded in the dry scientific language were warnings for those who could read between the lines. Marine life was changing faster than climate change alone could account for. New species were appearing that seemed designed rather than evolved, and always, they showed an intelligence that suggested guidance, purpose, intention. The government monitors Peggy's Cove more closely now. Underwater sensors detect movements that don't match any known marine life. Satellite imagery sometimes shows formations beneath the surface that look like cities, but only for frames before they vanish. And every full moon, signals are detected from the lighthouse that's supposedly automated. Messages in no human language, negotiations in frequencies that require specialized equipment to detect. The deepeners are patient. They've waited millennia, they can wait decades more. But their offers are becoming more frequent, more insistent. As sea levels rise, as coastal cities flood, as humanity faces the consequences of its choices, the beings in the deep places prepare for the great merger, the rejoining of the evolutionary paths that diverged when humanity's ancestors chose land over sea. And at Peggy's Cove, Harold Hensley tends his lights, maintaining the treaty that might be humanity's curse or salvation, documenting the slow transformation of a species that must adapt or drown, evolve or end, choose the deep places or fade into history like countless species before. The lighthouse beam sweeps the Atlantic, but those who know what to look for see it pause, focus, communicate. And sometimes, on the clearest nights, answers come from the depths. Lights that shouldn't exist, songs that shouldn't be heard, and promises of survival in forms humanity isn't ready to imagine. These 10 stories, gathered from classified reports, suppressed testimonies, and whispered accounts from Canada's remote communities, represent only a fraction of the horrors that lurk in the nation's small towns and wilderness areas. From the Wendigo stalking the forests of Ontario to the lighthouse keeper maintaining an ancient treaty with beings from the deep, these tales remind us that civilization's hold on these remote places is tenuous at best. The witnesses to these events are bound by legal agreements, threatened with consequences should they speak publicly about what they've seen. But trauma has a way of surfacing, and in hushed conversations, in leaked documents, in the nightmares of those who've encountered these impossibilities, the truth emerges. Canada's vast wilderness holds secrets that predate human memory, entities that existed before our species walked upright, and bargains made by desperate ancestors that still bind their descendants. The small towns that dot this enormous country aren't just isolated by geography, but by the weight of what they've witnessed, what they continue to witness, what they must never acknowledge officially exists. As climate change thaws ancient ice, as human activity penetrates deeper into untouched wilderness, as technology advances to detect what was once hidden, these encounters are becoming more frequent. The barriers between worlds are thinning. The old treaties are breaking. And the things that have waited in the deep places, the cold places, the dark places, are stirring. These stories are warnings. They're documentation of a reality that exists parallel to, but hidden from everyday life. They're testimony from those who've seen behind the veil and discovered that humanity shares this world with intelligences older, stranger, and more powerful than we dare acknowledge. In small towns across Canada, people lock their doors not against human intruders, but against things that knock with too many knuckles. They avoid certain roads during fog, certain lakes during winter, certain buildings that stand empty but never quite abandoned. They keep the old protections alive, salt lines, cold iron, prayers in languages that predate Christianity, because they know that skepticism is a luxury only those in cities can afford. The government maintains its silence, classifying encounters as natural disasters, gas leaks, mass hysteria. But the military units that respond to these incidents carry equipment that has no conventional purpose. The scientists who investigate sign agreements that bind them for life. And the survivors are relocated, compensated, and warned that speaking publicly about their experiences would be inadvisable. But the truth persists. In the gap between official reports and lived experience, in the space between what's possible and what's real, these stories exist. They're Canada's dark heritage, its hidden history, its ongoing nightmare that plays out in remote places where help is far away, and skepticism can be fatal. As you travel through Canada's small towns, remember these stories. Notice the houses that stay empty despite housing shortages. Observe the locals who won't make eye contact when certain places are mentioned. Listen for the silence that falls when outsiders ask too many questions about local history. And if you find yourself in a small town when fog rolls in, when winter ice forms strange patterns, when lights appear where no lights should be, remember that not all of Canada's dangers come from the cold or the wildlife. Some come from things that were here first, things that never left, things that wait with inhuman patience for humanity to make one crucial mistake.